Hello, and welcome to the third TUH University Hospital podcast series of Let's Talk About. In this series, we are going to talk about Down syndrome. You will find this and our previous series on the hospital YouTube channel, Facebook page, Apple Podcasts, and Podbean. Each episode is targeted at individuals with Down syndrome, their families and carers, health and social care staff, and anybody who has an interest in the health needs of adults with Down syndrome in Ireland. We will speak with experts from Down Syndrome Ireland, Children's Health Ireland, the Intellectual Disability Supplement to the Irish Longitudinal Study on Ageing, known as IDS-TILDA, and our own expert speakers in intellectual disability and the National Intellectual Disability Memory Service in TUH University Hospital. Hello, my name is Geraldine Kyle and I'm a registered nurse tutor at TUH University Hospital and a mother of a young adult with Down syndrome. In this first episode of the Let's Talk About Down Syndrome podcast series, I am delighted to welcome Nicola Hart and Ross O'Neill. Nicola is the National Research and Support Specialist of Down Syndrome Ireland. She is also a registered speech and language therapist. Ross is the Junior Administrator in Down Syndrome Ireland's National Office. He provides us with valuable insights into the experience of living with Down syndrome. A big welcome to you both.
Hi Geraldine.
Thanks, Geraldine.
So Ross, if it's okay, I'm going to start by asking you a few questions. We're talking about being healthy and about what happens when we need to visit the hospital. Can I ask you, what things do you do to keep healthy?
Make sure I eat healthy, go swimming and go for walks and bowling, because bowling is my favourite one that I do.
And when people with Down syndrome come to hospital for an appointment, Ross, or a blood test, for example, what would make it easier? What things could we do in the hospital to make it easier?
Yes, it's to make sure there's a nurse on standby to make sure that they're okay, they're comfortable, make sure that they're not too nervous going in to their appointment. So at least they'll be thinking, oh, this is great, going into my appointment and oh, there's a nurse beside me. You know, that's exactly what they're doing need. Yes.
So having somebody beside you would be helpful.
Yes, make sure they're okay, so they won't be too agitated. You know, because some people do get agitated. So at least to be a nurse on standby there, so they make sure that they're okay, they're not agitated before they go into their appointment.
Thank you, Ross. And if you need information from the hospital, Ross, do you find, is it better to tell you or to have it written down?
It's better having it written down, so at least they'll understand more, and at least what you can do is to have an easy read version of it, because some people with Down syndrome may not able to see or read it, so at least to be able to take it home and they show it to their parent, and the parent will go through it with them, so they will understand what they have to do in coming to a hospital appointment.
That's a really good suggestion, like an easy read version of information. Thank you, Ross. And what advice would you give to the staff about talking to a person with Down syndrome? So I know we sometimes have to write the information down, but if we have to say something, are there any things we should do that we could do it better?
Yeah, it's to make sure that when they're talking to the parent, it's to make sure they also talk to the person that has Down syndrome, because instead of leaving the person with Down syndrome out where they can talk to both of them, because that's exactly what they need to do, is to make sure that both areas are looked after by the hospital, so they can talk to both instead of just the one person.
And you know, that works well for a lot of people because there's a lot of things to remember. And if two people hear it, two is better than one, isn't it?
Yes.
Brilliant. And what do you think staff in the hospital can do to make the experience of people with Down syndrome in the hospital better? So you've already told me about talking to them and maybe also with their parent. Are there any other things we should do?
Yes, it's to make sure they are comfortable, make sure that they're looked after, they are welcomed in the hospital, and to make sure that they are comfortable, so at least they won't be too agitated coming into the hospital. And to make sure that when they come into the hospital, to be maybe new signs put up to make sure that they know exactly what areas they be going for their appointment, because that's what the hospital needs, is to have something like that put in place, because they know exactly for a parent and for the person with Down syndrome to come in and say, oh, this is where I'm going.
Very good. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you a rest, Ross, and I'm going to ask Nicola a couple of questions now. So, Nicola, could you tell us what Down syndrome is for somebody who maybe hasn't come across Down syndrome before?
Down syndrome is a chromosomal condition, so it's something that happens in the very, very early stages of the development of the baby. It's not an illness. It's not something you can catch. And I think that piece about Down syndrome not being a sickness is something that needs to be understood. I mean, but that said, people with Down syndrome, because of the chromosomal condition, may have tendency to some illnesses, maybe a higher risk for some illnesses than other people. So they might need to come in for more kind of checks or more blood tests for us, more things like that, just to stay on top of some of those conditions that they might have a higher risk for.
Okay, thank you very much. And following on from that, I suppose, could you tell us about some communication issues that might impact on the lives of adults living with Down syndrome?
Yeah, I think before talking about that, then it's important to really be aware that people with Down syndrome are individuals first, and that while there are certain characteristics associated with the syndrome, then it's very important to be aware that there are huge individual differences, and people need to be treated as an individual who is part of their own family rather than a person with Down syndrome. But that said, communication difficulties are very common, and we see it right from the very early stages that children with Down syndrome struggle to learn to speak and to understand language and to communicate well. So I think and those difficulties do persist into adulthood sometimes. Some people with Down syndrome won't manage verbal communication at all. They may still use signs or a communication aid, but although the majority will speak. And will understand spoken language. But I think it's important to know that that's an area of difficulty, particularly in an environment like a hospital where the messages that you're trying to communicate to somebody could be very important.
Absolutely. And so I suppose leading on from that again is that being aware of these potential communication challenges, could you share some good communication practices for healthcare staff that might be listening to our podcast?
Yeah, I think awareness is the first thing, to be aware that this is an area of difficulty for many people with Down syndrome. But I think also given that hospitals are often quite noisy environments, then it's also important to be aware that a lot of people with Down syndrome are much more likely to have a hearing difficulty than the typical population. So really important to to be aware of that and to realise that it can be very hard to understand language in a very noisy environment if your hearing isn't up to scratch. So I think that's something to be aware of. I think, again, given that this is an area of difficulty and the information is very important usually that you're trying to communicate, then slowing down, really just doing one thing at a time, focusing on the person and checking in with them to see if messages have been understood. And just to reiterate what Ross was saying, that given that spoken language can be difficult for people to understand, then having that backup information in a written form, ideally in an easy read written form so that it can be discussed afterwards, I think is really important. I think the other thing that we sometimes underestimate with anybody who has a language difficulty, then allowing that processing time is hugely important. So, and we're very, very bad at doing that. We don't like gaps in conversation. We fill those gaps with more talking and more things. And if you're struggling to process language, then that's just more information coming at you. So I think if you could only do one thing, if you could stop, breathe and count to 10 after you've asked a question or given some information, just to give the person chance to process that information and to see if they give them a chance of understanding that.
I think that's a really powerful take-home message. Thank you so much, Nicola. Before we wrap up, is there anything further that you think our listeners would like to learn from you today? Any further points that you want to raise?
Yeah, I mean, we did some work with some of our adult committees a couple of years ago about how they felt about going to hospital and how they were treated in hospital settings. And one of the messages that came out very strongly, and Ross mentioned it there, is, I am not a child. If there is an issue with my health, talk to me, not just to my parents. You can talk to my parents as well often. As Ross said, he'd prefer if they were included, but don't exclude the person with Down syndrome. Make sure that they are part of that conversation and that the information is primarily directed at them. I think that would be hugely important.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And Ross, I'd like to ask you the same thing. Is there anything else that you would like to say to the listeners of the podcast today that we didn't get to discuss earlier?
It's just to make sure to listen to both sides, listen to the parent and listen to the parents with Down syndrome, because that's exactly what we are working with day to day in the hospital here. It's not only the other people that are here as patients, there's also people coming in with forms of disability, wheelchairs and so on, and people with Down syndrome coming in and out. It's to make sure that they are provided for as well. So
great. I think that's a really important message to finish on. Thank you so much, Ross.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to our contributors Nicola and Ross this week. And thank you for listening. We discussed many resources during the course of the podcast that you might wish to access. We have set up a link on the TUH University Hospital website where you can read and learn more. In our next podcast, we will be joined by Fiona McGrain, clinical nurse specialist in Down syndrome, where we will cover the health needs of adults with Down syndrome and transitioning from children's services to adult services.